The scream tore through the night before Elena even understood why she was running. Her bare feet hit the cold stone floor of the palace hallway, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard it hurt. Something was wrong. She had felt it the moment she woke, an emptiness beside her in the bed where her husband should have been sleeping. Daemon Ashford, Alpha King of the Ashford territory, was not a man who left in the middle of the night without a word. Not since their wedding 3 months ago. Not until tonight. She followed the pull in her chest, the strange bond that connected her to him, guiding her through corridors lit only by dim wall torches. The palace was quiet, except for the sound of her own breathing, and the distant call of an owl somewhere beyond the windows. She told herself there was a simple explanation. Maybe a border alert. Maybe a council matter that could not wait until morning. She told herself many things as she moved faster, her silk robe trailing behind her like a ghost. The training grounds sat at the edge of the palace, surrounded by tall pine trees that turned silver under the moonlight. Elena had walked this path 100 times, usually in daylight, usually with laughter in the air, as young wolves practiced their forms under the watch of senior guards. Tonight it was empty. Tonight it was silent except for 2 voices, low and familiar, coming from behind the old stone archway. She stopped walking, her hand pressed against the rough wall to steady herself. One voice belonged to Daemon, low, warm, the same voice that had whispered promises to her on their wedding night. The second voice made her blood run cold, because she knew it as well as she knew her own. It belonged to Ivy Hale, the woman who had been her closest friend since they were children chasing fireflies in the same village, the woman who had stood beside her at the altar 3 months ago, wearing a smile that Elena now wondered if she had ever truly meant. Elena did not want to look. Some small, foolish part of her still hoped there was an explanation, that she would step around the corner and find nothing more than 2 old friends talking in the dark. She stepped forward anyway, because not knowing was worse than any truth waiting for her. The moonlight fell across the training yard, and there they were. Daemon's hand rested against Ivy's cheek, the same gentle touch he had once reserved only for Elena. Ivy was not pulling away. Her eyes were closed, her body leaning into him, as though this was not the first time, as though this had happened many times before, while Elena slept alone in the room she had once believed was shared with a man who loved her. The sound that left Elena's throat was not a scream. It was smaller than that, and somehow worse. A broken sound that came from somewhere deep inside her chest where trust used to live. Both of them turned at once. Ivy's face went white. She stepped back so quickly she nearly stumbled over a training post, her hands flying to her mouth, as though she could push the moment back into the darkness where it belonged. Daemon did not step back. He stood there, his jaw tight, his golden eyes catching the moonlight in a way that once made Elena's heart race with love, and now made her stomach twist with something close to hatred. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The wind moved through the pine trees, carrying the scent of night flowers that suddenly felt wrong, too sweet for a moment this bitter. Elena had grown up hearing stories about weak wolves, about mates who begged and cried when their partners strayed, about pack members who accepted betrayal because they believed love meant surviving on scraps. She had promised herself long ago that she would never become one of those stories. Standing there, with her husband's hand still lingering near her best friend's face, she reached for that promise like a rope thrown across a burning bridge. "Elena," Daemon finally said, his voice steady in a way that made the betrayal feel even colder. "This is not what you think." "Don't," Elena said. Her voice surprised her with how calm it sounded, though inside she felt like she was falling from a great height with no ground in sight. "Don't insult me by pretending I did not see what I saw." Ivy took a step toward her, tears already gathering in her eyes. "Elena, please, let me explain. It just happened. We didn't mean for this to—" "Just happened," Elena repeated. The words tasted bitter on her tongue. "You have been my sister since we were 6 years old, Ivy. You held my hand when my mother passed. You stood beside me when I married him. And this just happened?" Ivy had no answer for that. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, and for the first time in 20 years of friendship, Elena felt nothing but distance between them, a canyon too wide to ever cross again. Daemon stepped closer, and Elena instinctively stepped back, putting distance between herself and the man she had vowed to stand beside for the rest of her life. He noticed the movement, and something flickered across his face. though whether it was guilt or simple frustration at being caught, Elena could not tell anymore. She realized, with a strange clarity, that she no longer trusted herself to read him at all. "You need to understand the position I am in," Damon said, and there was an edge of impatience creeping into his voice now, as though Elena's pain was an inconvenience rather than a wound he had caused. "Our marriage secured peace between two territories. It was never meant to be anything more than that." The words landed like a physical blow. Elena had known, of course, that politics had shaped their union. Every pack marriage among the ruling families carried that weight. But she had believed, foolishly perhaps, that something real had grown between them in the months since their wedding. She had believed the way he held her at night meant something. She had believed the way he introduced her to visiting alphas, with pride evident in his voice, meant something too. "Then you should have told me that from the beginning," Elena said, her voice finally beginning to shake, though not from weakness, from fury, sharp and clean, cutting through the fog of shock that had carried her this far. "You let me believe in something that was never real. And you did it with her." She looked at Ivy one final time, searching for some trace of the girl who used to braid flowers into her hair, who used to sit with her under the old oak tree near their childhood home, and promised that nothing would ever come between them. She found nothing familiar there anymore, only a stranger wearing a face she used to love. "How long?" Elena asked, though part of her did not want to know the answer. Ivy's silence answered before her words did. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Since before the wedding." The ground seemed to tilt beneath Elena's feet. Before the wedding. All those months of preparation, of dress fittings and flower arrangements, of Ivy sitting beside her laughing about the future, had been built on a lie that ran deeper than Elena had ever imagined. Every memory she had of her best friend's excitement for her wedding day now felt poisoned, tainted by a secret that had been growing in the shadows the entire time. Elena felt something inside her shift, like a door closing on a room she would never enter again. The grief was still there, sharp and enormous, but underneath it, something steadier was beginning to form. A cold, clear resolve that she recognized from stories her father used to tell her about the strength of their bloodline, about wolves who faced betrayal and chose survival over despair. "I want a divorce," Elena said, and the words felt strange leaving her mouth, foreign and heavy, but also strangely freeing. Damon's expression hardened. "You are speaking out of anger. Think about what you are saying. A divorce would shatter the alliance between our territories. It would weaken both packs in front of every rival family watching us." "Then perhaps you should have considered that before you touched her," Elena said. "You do not get to lecture me about consequences, Damon. Not tonight." For a moment, something like regret passed over his face, quick and fleeting, gone before Elena could decide if it was real or simply another performance. She was too tired to care which one it was. She turned away from both of them, her robe catching the wind as she walked back toward the palace, her spine straight, despite the way her entire world had just come apart at the seams. Behind her, she heard Ivy's voice calling out, pleading with her to wait, to talk, to let her explain further. Elena did not turn around. Some bridges, once burned, were not meant to be rebuilt, no matter how loudly someone begged from the other side of the fire. She walked through the empty corridors of the palace that had been her home for 3 months, past portraits of Ashford ancestors staring down at her with painted eyes, past the room where she had once dreamed of raising children with a man who apparently viewed their marriage as nothing more than a political arrangement. Each step felt heavier than the last, yet somehow, her back stayed straight, her chin stayed level. By the time she reached her chambers, the first hint of dawn was beginning to color the sky outside her window, pale gold bleeding into the darkness, like a wound slowly opening. Elena sat on the edge of the bed she had shared with Damon, staring at her own hands as though they belonged to someone else. She thought of her father, gone now for many years, the last true alpha of the Voss bloodline before their pack fell into ruin after a conflict she had been too young to fully understand. She thought of the stories he used to tell her, about strength that came, not from a mate or an alliance, but from the fire that lived inside a person's own chest, waiting to be called upon when everything else had burned away. Tonight, that fire had been lit, whether Elena wanted it or not. She would not spend the rest of her life as a footnote in Damon Ashford's story, a wife discarded for a friend, who had never truly been a friend at all. She would not let Ivy's betrayal or Damon's cruelty define what came next for her. Somewhere beneath the grief and the anger, a new purpose was beginning to take shape, though Elena could not yet see its full form. For now, she simply sat in the growing light of dawn, alone in a room that no longer felt like home, and allowed herself to grieve for the marriage she had believed in, the friendship she had trusted completely, and the version of herself who had walked into that palace 3 months ago, believing love was enough to build a life on. By the time the sun fully rose over the Ashford territory, Elena had made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. She was done being someone's convenient arrangement. She was done being underestimated. Whatever came next, she would face it standing on her own 2 feet, and she would never again mistake silence for safety, or smiles for loyalty. The palace outside her window began to stir with the sounds of mourning, servants moving through hallways, guards changing posts, the ordinary rhythm of a kingdom that had no idea its queen's heart had shattered hours before sunrise. Elena rose from the bed, wiped the last of her tears with the back of her hand, and looked at her reflection in the tall mirror across the room. The woman staring back at her looked tired, yes, and hurt beyond measure. But there was something else in her eyes too, something that had not been there the day before. A spark of the fire her father always spoke of, small but unmistakable, burning steadily in the wreckage of everything she thought she had known. Elena straightened her shoulders, took a slow breath, and began to plan. The council chamber had never felt so cold. Elena stood at its center 3 days after the night that broke her world apart, dressed not in the soft gowns Damon had gifted her as his wife, but in a simple dark tunic that belonged to her before the marriage, before the crown, before any of it. The elders of the Ashford territory sat around the long table, their faces unreadable, waiting for her to speak. Damon sat at the head of the table, his expression carefully composed, though Elena could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the armrests just a little too tightly. She had not slept in 3 days. Grief had a way of stealing sleep, replacing it with long hours of staring at ceilings and replaying moments she wished she could erase. But exhaustion had not weakened her resolve. If anything, it had sharpened it into something hard and clear, like glass forged in fire. "I have called this meeting to formally end my marriage to Alpha King Damon Ashford," Elena said, her voice carrying through the chamber without a single tremor. Several of the elders exchanged glances, clearly having heard rumors already, though none had expected her to address it so directly, so soon. An older wolf named Garrick, one of Damon's most trusted advisors, cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, surely this is a matter that could be discussed privately, rather than—" "I would have preferred that as well," Elena interrupted, meeting his gaze without flinching. "But secrets have already cost me enough. I will not build my future on more of them." Damon shifted in his seat. "Elena, please. This council does not need every detail of what happened between us. They deserve to know why their queen is walking away," Elena said, turning to face him fully, for the first time since entering the room. "They deserve to know that the alliance you valued so highly was never something you respected enough to remain faithful to." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Elena watched as several elders' expressions shifted from confusion to understanding, and in a few cases, quiet disappointment directed at their Alpha King. Damon's jaw tightened further, but he said nothing to contradict her, because there was nothing left to say that would not make things worse for him. "The territory cannot afford instability right now," Garrick said carefully, glancing between the two of them. "Rival packs to the north have been testing our borders. A public divorce, especially one involving betrayal, would signal weakness. Then perhaps you should have considered that before allowing your Alpha King's actions to threaten this territory's stability," Elena replied evenly. "I am not the one who created this weakness. I am simply the one refusing to hide it." Damon finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "Elena, think carefully about what you are doing. If you walk away from this marriage, you walk away from everything that comes with it. Your title, your place in this territory, the protection this alliance offers you." Elena almost laughed at that, though there was no humor in the sound that nearly escaped her. Protection. As if a marriage built on lies had ever truly protected her from anything at all. "I did not marry you for protection, Damon," she said quietly. "I married you because I believed we could build something real together. I was wrong about that. but I refuse to be wrong twice by staying somewhere I am not valued. The room fell silent. Even Garrick, who had spent years defending Damon's decisions without question, seemed to have no argument left to offer. Elena felt the weight of every eye in that chamber, some sympathetic, some calculating, all of them waiting to see what would happen next. I am formally requesting the dissolution of this marriage, Elena continued, straightening her shoulders. I will not ask for wealth or land from this territory. I ask only for my freedom, and for the return of what belonged to my family before it fell. Damon's eyes narrowed slightly. Your family's land has been unclaimed for over a decade. It is little more than ruins now. Then it should mean nothing to you to let me have it, Elena said simply. The elders whispered among themselves again, clearly surprised by the modesty of her request. Most divorced mates in their world fought bitterly over territory, wealth, and titles. Elena wanted none of that. She wanted only the chance to walk away and build something that belonged entirely to her, untouched by Damon's name or his broken promises. Garrick leaned toward Damon, speaking in a low voice that Elena could still hear clearly, thanks to her sharpened senses. Perhaps it would be wise to grant her request quickly, before this scandal spreads further and damages our standing with neighboring packs. Damon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Elena, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time since the wedding. Perhaps he was. Perhaps 3 months of comfortable arrangement had blinded him to the strength that had always existed beneath her calm exterior, the same strength that had carried her through the loss of her family, and now carried her through the loss of her marriage. Fine, Damon said finally, his voice tight with something that might have been pride, or perhaps regret, though Elena no longer cared to guess which. You may have the land. I will have the papers drawn up by tomorrow. Elena nodded once, refusing to let relief show on her face, though it flooded through her chest like a long-held breath finally released. Thank you. As the meeting ended and the elders began filing out of the chamber, murmuring among themselves about the sudden turn of events, Elena felt a presence beside her. She turned to find Ivy standing near the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. Elena, Ivy said softly, please, can we talk? Elena studied her former friend for a long moment, searching for any trace of genuine remorse beneath the guilt written plainly across Ivy's face. She found some, perhaps, but it did not matter anymore. Remorse could not undo months of secrets, could not rebuild trust that had been shattered so completely. There is nothing left to say, Elena said, and though her voice remained calm, there was a finality to it that made Ivy flinch. You made your choice a long time ago. Now I am making mine. She walked past Ivy without another word, her footsteps echoing through the palace hallway as she made her way toward her chambers to begin packing the few belongings she considered truly her own. Behind her, she heard Ivy's quiet crying, but she did not turn back. Some wounds needed distance to heal, not more conversation. That evening, as Elena folded her clothing into a simple traveling bag, a knock sounded at her door. She expected a servant, perhaps bringing news about the paperwork Damon had promised. Instead, she found an unfamiliar young wolf standing in the hallway, a folded letter in his hands. Your Majesty, he said, bowing slightly, this arrived for you. The messenger said it was urgent, from beyond the northern border. Elena took the letter with a frown, unfamiliar with any correspondence beyond Ashford territory, since her own family's fall from power years ago. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded the parchment, her eyes scanning the elegant handwriting inside. The letter was from an old friend of her father's, a wolf named Callum Winters, who had served as her father's second-in-command before the Voss Pact collapsed. He had heard, through channels Elena did not fully understand, that she intended to reclaim her family's territory. He offered his services, along with a small group of loyal wolves who had never forgotten their old alpha's daughter. Elena read the letter twice, her heart beating faster with each word. She had expected to rebuild alone, to face the ruins of her family's land with nothing but her own 2 hands, and whatever strength she could summon from grief and determination. The idea that others remembered her, that others believed in the possibility of the Voss name rising again, filled her with something she had not felt in days: hope. She sat down at the small writing desk in her chambers and began composing a response, her hands steady, despite the exhaustion still weighing on her body. She thanked Callum for his loyalty and accepted his offer of help, promising to meet him and his group at the border of her family's old territory within the week. As she sealed the letter and prepared it for the morning messenger, Elena allowed herself a small, tired smile. 3 days ago, she had lost everything she believed her life would be. Tonight, for the first time since that terrible moment in the training yard, she felt something other than grief pulling her forward. She thought of her father again, of the stories he used to tell about the strength of their bloodline, about wolves who rebuilt what others had destroyed, through nothing but sheer will and loyalty to something greater than themselves. She had spent years believing those stories belonged only to the past. Now, standing at the edge of an uncertain future, she wondered if perhaps they were meant to belong to her too. The next morning, Elena rose before dawn, just as she had on the night everything changed. This time, however, there was no fear pulling her through the hallways, no dread of what she might find. There was only purpose, clear and steady, guiding her steps as she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the palace that had never truly felt like home. Damon found her in the courtyard as she loaded her modest belongings onto a borrowed horse, the early morning mist curling around them both like a final farewell from a place neither of them would remember fondly. He said nothing at first, simply watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "You are really leaving," he finally said, not quite a question. "I am," Elena replied, tightening the last strap on her saddlebag. "There is nothing here for me anymore." Damon stepped closer, his voice softening in a way that might have moved her once, before the training yard, before the truth had come crashing down around them both. "I never meant to hurt you, Elena." Elena turned to face him fully, studying his face one last time, searching for the man she had once believed she was building a future with. She found only a stranger now, someone whose choices had cost her more than he would ever fully understand. "Perhaps not," she said quietly, "but you did, and now I have to live with that, just as you will have to live with what you chose." She mounted her horse without waiting for a response, gathering the reins in steady hands. As she rode through the palace gates for the final time, she did not look back. Whatever waited for her beyond those walls, whatever ruins of her family's land she was about to reclaim, it belonged entirely to her, untouched by betrayal, unshadowed by broken promises. The road ahead was long, and Elena had no illusions about how difficult the journey would be. But for the first time in days, she felt something steady taking root in her chest, something that felt remarkably like the beginning of a new kind of strength. The ruins of Voss territory rose out of the morning fog like the bones of something once alive. Elena had not seen this land since she was a small child, carried away in the arms of a servant during the chaos that ended her family's rule. She remembered fragments only, the smell of smoke, the sound of her mother's voice telling her to stay quiet, the feeling of running through trees that seemed impossibly tall to a frightened little girl. Now, riding back into that same forest as a grown woman, she saw the truth of what had been left behind. Broken walls covered in moss, a watchtower leaning dangerously to one side, its wood rotted through by years of neglect. A training yard, reclaimed entirely by wild grass and stubborn young trees pushing up through cracked stone. It was not much to look at, but it was hers. Callum Winters was waiting for her at the edge of what had once been the main gate, exactly as he had promised in his letter. He was older than Elena remembered from the scattered memories of her childhood, his dark hair now streaked with gray, deep lines etched around his eyes from years of hardship. But his posture remained strong, his gaze steady and respectful as she approached. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing deeply, "welcome home." Behind him stood a small group of wolves, perhaps 15 in total, ranging from young adults to grizzled elders, who had clearly seen their share of difficult years. They watched Elena with expressions of cautious hope, the kind of look people gave something they desperately wanted to believe in, but were afraid to trust too quickly. "Please, rise," Elena said, dismounting from her horse. "And you do not need to call me that. Not yet. I have not earned the title again." Callum straightened, a small smile touching his weathered face. "With respect, my lady, you never lost it. You simply had it taken from you by circumstances beyond your control. That is different from losing something through your own failure." Elena felt a lump rise in her throat at his words, though she pushed the emotion down, unwilling to show weakness in front of people she was meeting for the first time as their potential leader. She looked past Callum to the small group behind him, studying each face carefully. "Tell me about yourselves," she said. "I want to know who has chosen to stand with me." One by one, the wolves introduced themselves. There was a young woman named Rosalind, barely 20 years old, who had lost her parents in the same conflict that destroyed the Voss Pack, and had spent years drifting between territories with no true home. There was an older man named Fenwick, once a blacksmith for Elena's father, who still carried the calloused hands of his trade despite years without proper tools or a forge to work in. There were siblings, twins, named Aidan and Bree, whose family had served the Voss bloodline for 3 generations before everything collapsed. Each story added another layer of weight to Elena's shoulders, but also another layer of determination. These were not simply strangers looking for a new leader to follow. These were people who had lost as much as she had, who understood the particular ache of watching something precious crumble beyond repair. If she was going to rebuild this territory, she owed it to every single one of them to do it properly. "We have very little," Callum admitted as he led Elena through the ruins, pointing out crumbling structures and overgrown paths that had once been the busy streets of a thriving pack territory. "No proper shelter beyond a few structures we have managed to patch together, limited supplies, no trained warriors beyond what basic skills some of us remember from before the fall." Elena studied the destruction around her, mentally cataloging what needed to be done. The task ahead felt impossibly large, a mountain of work stretching endlessly in every direction. But somewhere beneath the exhaustion of the past few days, a spark of something else was beginning to grow. Not naive optimism, but something steadier. The recognition that impossible tasks were sometimes accomplished simply by refusing to stop taking the next step forward. "Then we begin with shelter," Elena said firmly, "and we begin today." The next several hours passed in a blur of activity, unlike anything Elena had experienced since before her marriage to Damon. She worked alongside Callum and the others, clearing debris from what had once been the main hall of her father's old command post, salvaging usable wood and stone from collapsed structures nearby. Her hands, once soft from months of palace life, quickly became rough and blistered, but she did not complain, did not slow her pace, even as the sun climbed higher, and sweat soaked through her simple tunic. Rosalind worked beside her for much of the afternoon, and Elena found herself grateful for the young woman's quiet company. Unlike Ivy, whose friendship had ultimately proven hollow, Rosalind's presence felt uncomplicated, honest in a way that Elena had not realized she was craving until she found it. "Can I ask you something, my lady?" Rosalind said as they worked together, hauling a heavy wooden beam toward the growing pile of salvageable materials. "Of course," Elena replied, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "Why did you really come back?" Rosalind asked, her voice careful, as though she feared the question might be too forward. "You could have stayed in Ashford territory. You could have fought for your position there, or found somewhere easier to start over. Why choose this? Why choose ruins?" Elena considered the question for a long moment, setting down her end of the beam as she gathered her thoughts. "Because ruins can be rebuilt," she finally said. "But trust, once it is truly broken, cannot always be repaired. I would rather build something new from nothing than try to force something broken back into a shape it can no longer hold." Rosalind nodded slowly, understanding evident in her young face despite her limited years. "My parents used to say something similar, that it is easier to plant a new garden than to force dead flowers to bloom again." "Your parents sound wise," Elena said softly. "They were," Rosalind replied, her voice tightening slightly with old grief. "I miss them every day. But I think they would be glad to see me here, helping rebuild something that matters." The two women continued working in companionable silence after that, and Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a small but meaningful connection forming with someone who understood loss, without needing lengthy explanations. It was different from what she had shared with Ivy, simpler somehow, built on mutual respect rather than years of assumed closeness that had ultimately proven false. As evening approached, the group gathered around a small fire that Fenwick had managed to build near the center of the cleared main hall. Someone had managed to hunt a small deer earlier in the day, and the smell of roasting meat filled the cool evening air, mixing with wood smoke in a way that felt strangely comforting, despite the primitive conditions surrounding them. Elena sat among her small group of followers, watching the flames dance, and listening to quiet conversation flowing around her. For the first time, since the night in the training yard, she felt something close to peace settle over her, fragile but real. "Tomorrow we will need to assess what remains of the old training grounds," Callum said, breaking the comfortable silence. "If we are to defend this territory properly, we will need trained fighters, not just willing hands." "Agreed," Elena said, "and we will need to reach out to any other Voss loyalists who might still be scattered throughout the region. If word spreads that we are rebuilding, others may choose to return." "There is also the matter of resources," Fenwick added, his gruff voice carrying easily across the small fire. "We have enough to survive for now, but not enough to grow quickly. We will need trade partners, or at the very least, safe passage to nearby markets." Elena nodded, mentally adding each concern to the growing list of challenges ahead. The path forward would not be easy. She understood that clearly. Understood that rebuilding a fallen territory required more than simple determination. It required strategy, patience, and the willingness to make difficult decisions that would not always please everyone. But looking around the fire at the faces gathered there, faces that held genuine hope despite years of hardship, Elena felt something solidify inside her. This was not simply about proving Damon wrong, or showing Ivy that her betrayal had not destroyed her. This was about honoring the people who had chosen to believe in her, who had chosen to stand beside her when they could have easily chosen an easier path elsewhere. "We will figure it out together," Elena said, her voice carrying quiet conviction that seemed to settle over the group like a warm blanket against the cold night air. "Step by step, we will rebuild what was taken from all of us." Callum raised his cup of water in a small, informal toast to the return of the Voss bloodline. The others raised their own cups and bowls in response, murmuring agreement, and Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though this time they were not born from grief. They were born from something closer to gratitude, from the overwhelming realization that even after losing so much, she had not truly lost everything. Later that night, as the others settled into makeshift shelters scattered around the cleared main hall, Elena found herself standing alone, near the ruins of what had once been her father's private study. Moonlight filtered through broken walls, illuminating faded markings on the stone floor where furniture had once stood. She closed her eyes, trying to remember her father's voice, his presence, the way he used to speak about leadership and sacrifice, when she was still too young to fully understand his words. "I hope I am making you proud," she whispered into the darkness, though she knew no answer would come. Her father had been gone for many years now, lost in the same conflict that had scattered their pack and stolen their home. But standing there, surrounded by the ruins of everything her family had once built, Elena felt something that resembled his presence anyway, a quiet strength settling into her bones, urging her forward into whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. She thought of Damon, briefly, and of Ivy, and found that the sharp edges of her grief had begun to dull slightly, replaced by purpose too large to leave much room for lingering on betrayal. They had chosen their path. She was choosing hers. And for the first time in days, that choice felt less like an ending. Elena returned to the small shelter Callum had prepared for her, lying down on a simple bedroll that felt harder than anything she had slept on in months, yet somehow more honest than the soft palace bed she had shared with a husband who never truly valued her. Sleep came easier than she expected, deep and dreamless, the exhaustion of hard labor finally overtaking the grief that had kept her awake for days. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, for the first time in what felt like a very long time, Elena slept peacefully in the ruins that were slowly, steadily, beginning to feel like home. 3 weeks passed before the first real threat arrived at the border of Voss territory. Elena heard the warning horn before she fully understood what it meant. Its low, urgent call, echoing across the rebuilt training yard, where she had spent the morning working with Callum on basic defense formations. The small group of loyalists had grown steadily since her arrival, now numbering nearly 40 wolves, drawn by word spreading through the region that the Voss bloodline was rising again. But 40 wolves, many of them untrained in combat, felt like a fragile number when measured against the sound of an approaching threat. "Scouts," Callum said grimly, already moving toward the makeshift watchtower they had repaired during the second week of rebuilding, from the northern border. Elena followed close behind him, her heart pounding as she climbed the uneven wooden ladder to the top of the tower. In the distance, she could see a group of riders approaching, perhaps a dozen strong, their banners unfamiliar against the pale morning sky. Not Ashford colors, she noted with some relief, though the relief did little to calm the tension coiling in her stomach. Who are they? She asked, squinting against the morning light. Hard to say from this distance, Callum replied, his weathered face creased with concern. But that banner belongs to the Thornwood Pack, if I remember correctly. They control the territory just north of here. Elena had heard whispers of the Thornwood Pack during her time in Ashford territory, though she had never had direct dealings with them. They were known for their aggressive expansion tactics, frequently absorbing weaker packs into their territory through intimidation rather than outright conflict. If they had heard about the Voss rebuilding efforts, it was entirely possible they viewed this fledgling territory as an easy target for expansion. We need to prepare, Elena said, already turning to descend the ladder. Gather everyone in the main hall. We cannot afford to look unprepared. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of organized chaos, as Callum and Fenwick worked to arrange the Loyalists into something resembling a defensive formation, while Elena changed into more practical clothing and retrieved the sword her father had left behind, one of the few possessions that had survived the pack's fall all those years ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the weapon to her belt, though she forced herself to breathe steadily, refusing to let fear control her actions. By the time the Thornwood riders reached the outer edge of the rebuilt territory, Elena stood at the front of her small group, flanked by Callum and Fenwick, projecting as much calm authority as she could manage, despite the anxiety twisting through her chest. The riders slowed their horses as they approached, eventually stopping perhaps 20 feet away, their leader dismounting with practiced ease. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that swept across the rebuilt training yard with obvious calculation. Elena recognized the assessment immediately, the same kind of look a predator might give potential prey, before deciding whether the hunt was worth the effort. I am Marcus Thornwood, the man announced, his voice carrying easily across the open space between them. Beta of the Thornwood Pack. We have heard rumors of activity in this territory, and came to investigate. I am Elena Voss, Elena replied, keeping her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart. This territory belongs to my family, and we are simply reclaiming what was always ours. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly, though his expression remained carefully neutral. The Voss bloodline. I had heard rumors, but I confess I did not fully believe them. This land has sat empty for over a decade. Empty does not mean abandoned, Elena said firmly. My family's claim to this territory was never formally relinquished. Perhaps not, Marcus said, taking a slow step closer, his gaze assessing the small group of loyalists gathered behind Elena. But claims mean little without the strength to defend them. My Alpha has been considering expansion into this region for some time. He may not look kindly on a rival claim, particularly one backed by such modest numbers. The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Elena felt Callum shift slightly beside her, his hand moving closer to the hilt of his weapon, but she raised a subtle hand to keep him steady. Violence now, against a force clearly superior in numbers and training, would be foolish beyond measure. Modest numbers can grow, Elena said, meeting Marcus's gaze without flinching. And I would remind you that the Voss bloodline once commanded significant respect throughout this region, before circumstances beyond our control led to our decline. That history does not simply disappear because our numbers are currently smaller than your packs. Marcus studied her for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind his eyes. You speak with confidence for someone commanding so little actual power. Confidence and power are not always the same thing, Elena replied, but underestimating either can prove costly. A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sound of horses shifting their weight nearby. Elena held her ground, refusing to show the fear coiling tightly in her chest, refusing to let this man see anything other than steady resolve. She thought of her father, of the stories she had grown up hearing about his own difficult negotiations with rival packs, and drew strength from memories that felt more real to her now than they had in years. Finally, Marcus's expression shifted, something almost like respect flickering across his sharp features. I will relay your position to my Alpha, he said, though I would advise you to consider your options carefully in the coming weeks. Expansion is often easier to prevent through alliance than through conflict. I will keep that in mind, Elena said carefully, though she had no intention of allowing her fledgling territory to be absorbed into another pack's control so soon after reclaiming her independence. Marcus mounted his horse once more, his sharp gaze lingering on Elena for a moment longer, before he signaled his riders to turn back toward the northern border. Elena watched them go, her body remaining tense long after the last horse had disappeared from view, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly beginning to fade and leave exhaustion in its wake. That was well handled, Callum said quietly, once the riders were fully out of sight. But I fear this was only the first of many such visits we will receive. I know, Elena admitted, finally allowing her shoulders to relax slightly. We need allies, Callum. Real ones, not simply loyal followers who mean well, but lack the strength to defend what we are building here. Callum nodded slowly, understanding evident in his expression. There are other scattered packs throughout this region, smaller territories that have struggled since larger powers like Thornwood began their expansion efforts. They might welcome the chance to align with a legitimate bloodline against a common threat. Elena considered this, her mind already working through the possibilities. An alliance built on mutual protection rather than dependence could strengthen her position significantly, without requiring her to sacrifice the independence she had fought so hard to reclaim. Draft a list of potential allies, Elena said. Territories that might share our concerns about Thornwood's expansion. We will begin reaching out immediately. Over the following days, Elena threw herself into the work of building alliances with the same determination she had shown in physically rebuilding her family's territory. Messengers were sent to neighboring packs, carefully worded letters, proposing mutual defense agreements and trade partnerships that would benefit both parties, without requiring either side to surrender their autonomy. The responses trickled in slowly at first, cautious and uncertain, but gradually warming, as word spread that Elena Voss was building something legitimate, something worth taking seriously. A small pack called Ironvale, situated just west of Voss territory, was the first to respond positively, their alpha expressing genuine interest in a formal alliance after years of feeling vulnerable to Thornwood's aggressive tactics. Elena traveled to Ironvale territory personally to negotiate the terms, leaving Callum in charge of continued defenses back home. The Ironvale Alpha, an older woman named Delphine Marsh, greeted her with genuine warmth, clearly relieved to find a potential ally who understood the particular anxiety of watching a stronger power circle closer with each passing season. Your father was known throughout this region as a fair leader, Delphine said, as they sat together discussing terms over a simple meal. Many of us hoped, when we heard rumors of the Voss bloodline returning, that his daughter might carry forward that same reputation. I intend to, Elena said firmly, though I understand reputation must be earned, not simply inherited. Delphine smiled, something approving in her expression. Wise words. Very well. Ironvale will formally ally with Voss territory. We will support each other against outside threats, and establish fair trade terms that benefit us both. The alliance was formalized within days, and word of it spread quickly throughout the region, exactly as Elena had hoped. Other smaller packs, previously hesitant to commit to any formal arrangement, began reaching out as well, eager to align themselves with a growing coalition that offered protection against Thornwood's expansion, without demanding the kind of subservience larger powers typically required. Within a month of the confrontation with Marcus Thornwood, Elena found herself commanding not simply a small group of loyalists rebuilding ruins, but the beginning of a genuine coalition, small still, compared to established powers like Ashford or Thornwood, but growing steadily stronger with each passing week. Word of her success eventually reached even the distant corners of the region, carried by traveling merchants and wandering wolves seeking new territories to call home. Elena did not know it yet, but that word was beginning to travel far enough that it would soon reach ears she had hoped never to hear from again. News of the Voss coalition reached Ashford territory on a rainy afternoon, carried by a traveling merchant who spoke of it in passing while trading goods at the palace market. Damon Ashford heard the news secondhand, through a servant who mentioned it while delivering his evening meal, and something tightened uncomfortably in his chest at the mention of Elena's name. It had been nearly 2 months since she rode away from the palace gates without looking back, 2 months during which he had told himself, repeatedly, that her absence changed nothing important about his life or his kingdom. He was beginning to understand how wrong that assumption had been. The territory had grown quieter since Elena's departure, though not in any way that suggested peace. Trade negotiations that she had once handled with effortless skill now stalled under his direct management. Visiting Alphas, noting her absence with pointed questions, he struggled to answer, without revealing the full truth of what had happened. Ivy, who had moved into a more prominent position within the palace following Elena's departure, proved surprisingly unhelpful in matters of diplomacy, her skills lying elsewhere, in charm and social gatherings rather than the careful strategic thinking Elena had always brought to difficult negotiations. "You seem distracted," Ivy said one evening, finding Damon standing alone on the palace balcony, staring out at the darkening territory beyond the walls. She had taken to spending most evenings with him since Elena's departure, though the easy affection that once existed between them during their secret meetings now felt strained, weighed down by the consequences neither of them had fully anticipated. "There is much to consider," Damon replied vaguely, not turning to look at her. "The northern trade routes require attention, and the council has raised concerns about our standing with neighboring territories." Ivy stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm, in a gesture that once might have felt comforting, but now simply felt hollow. "Elena handled those matters well, I know. But you do not need her for this territory to thrive, Damon. We can figure it out together." Damon said nothing, though privately he found himself doubting her words more with each passing week. Ivy's presence, once thrilling in its secrecy, now felt increasingly insufficient, measured against the steady competence Elena had always brought to their shared responsibilities. He hated himself slightly for the comparison, hated the way his mind kept drifting back to memories of Elena's careful diplomatic maneuvering, her genuine care for the well-being of their people, qualities he had taken entirely for granted until they were gone. "The merchant mentioned something interesting today," Damon said finally, changing the subject. "Rumors of activity in the old Voss territory. Apparently Elena has been rebuilding there, gathering loyalists and forming alliances with smaller packs in the region." Ivy's expression flickered, something unreadable passing across her face. "That seems unlikely. That land has been ruins for years. What could she possibly accomplish there alone?" "She is not entirely alone, apparently," Damon replied, recalling the details the merchant had shared. "And from what I understand, her efforts have been more successful than either of us might have expected." A strange tension settled over the balcony, neither of them quite willing to voice the unease that Elena's apparent success stirred within them both. For Damon, it was a complicated mixture of guilt and something he refused to name as regret, though it felt uncomfortably close to that particular emotion. For Ivy, though she said nothing aloud, it was something closer to fear, an uneasy recognition that her betrayal had not destroyed Elena as thoroughly as she might have once assumed. Over the following weeks, more reports trickled into Ashford territory regarding Elena's growing coalition. A formal alliance with Ironvale territory, successful trade negotiations with several smaller packs previously loyal to no one, a confrontation with Thornwood forces that had, according to the reports, ended without violence, but with clear respect earned on Elena's part. Each piece of news landed heavier than the last, and Damon found himself increasingly distracted during council meetings, his attention drifting toward thoughts of Elena's success, even as his own territory continued struggling with issues that had once seemed manageable under her careful guidance. The northern trade routes remained problematic. Two smaller allied packs had quietly withdrawn their formal support, citing vague concerns about stability within Ashford leadership. Whispers had begun circulating among the elders, questions about whether the divorce had truly been necessary, whether Damon's judgment could be fully trusted following such a public scandal. "The council is growing restless," Garrick informed Damon during a private meeting nearly 3 months after Elena's departure. "Several elders have expressed concerns that our territory's standing has weakened considerably since Elena Voss left. Her connections, her diplomatic skill, these were valuable assets that we have struggled to replace." "I am aware," Damon said tersely, frustration coloring his voice, "but dwelling on what we lost accomplishes nothing. We must move forward." "With respect, Alpha King," Garrick continued carefully, "moving forward requires acknowledging what went wrong in the first place. The council is not blind to the circumstances surrounding the divorce. Many wonder if similar judgment errors might affect other decisions within this territory." The implication stung, though Damon recognized the truth underlying Garrick's careful words. His personal choices had created ripples that extended far beyond his private life, weakening the very foundation of stability he had once taken for granted. He thought of Elena's calm strength during that final council meeting, the way she had walked away, without demanding wealth or vengeance, simply asking for the chance to rebuild something entirely her own. He wondered, with growing unease, whether he had truly understood what he was losing when he let her walk away so easily. That evening, Damon found himself standing once again on the palace balcony, though this time alone, Ivy having retreated to her own chambers following a tense conversation about the council's growing concerns. He stared out at the darkening horizon, thinking of the woman who had once stood beside him at this very spot, discussing territory matters with quiet confidence that he had never fully appreciated until it was gone. The sound of footsteps behind him drew his attention, and he turned to find Garrick approaching, an unusual expression of concern etched across the older wolf's weathered face. "Alpha King, there is something you should know," Garrick said, his voice careful. "I have received word that Thornwood forces attempted to test Voss territory's borders again last week. They were repelled, successfully, by a combined force of Voss and Ironvale warriors." Damon absorbed this information silently, feeling something complicated settle in his chest. Relief, perhaps, that Elena remained safe. Pride, unexpectedly, at her continued success, despite everything working against her. And underneath both of those emotions, something sharper, something closer to regret, at watching her build something remarkable, while he struggled simply to maintain what he already had. "She is doing well," Damon said quietly, more to himself than to Garrick. "She is doing remarkably well," Garrick agreed, studying his Alpha King's expression carefully. "Perhaps better than any of us anticipated when she rode away from this territory 3 months ago." Damon said nothing further, allowing silence to stretch between them as he continued staring out at the horizon, his thoughts tangled with complicated emotions he was not yet ready to fully examine. Whatever he had once believed about the nature of his marriage to Elena, whatever careless assumptions had led him to prioritize a secret affair over the genuine partnership they had built together, those beliefs now felt increasingly foolish, measured against the reality of watching her thrive independently, without any need for him, or the protection he had once claimed only marriage to him could provide. Garrick eventually excused himself, leaving Damon alone once more with his thoughts, as darkness fully settled over Ashford territory. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in the ruins that Elena was steadily transforming into something new, she was building a legacy entirely her own, unburdened by his mistakes, unshadowed by the betrayal that had once threatened to define her entire future. Damon did not yet know what to do with the uncomfortable realization slowly taking root within him, the recognition that perhaps he had made a far greater error than he initially understood on that terrible night in the training yard. But standing alone on that balcony, watching stars emerge across the darkening sky, he found himself wondering, for the first time, what might have been possible if he had simply valued what he already had, rather than reaching for something that ultimately cost him more than he had ever anticipated. 6 months after riding away from Ashford territory, Elena stood atop the newly repaired watchtower, overlooking a landscape unrecognizable from the ruins she had first encountered. The training yard below buzzed with organized activity, young wolves practicing combat formations under Callum's watchful supervision, while others worked at repairing the last of the outer walls that would soon fully enclose the growing settlement. The main hall, once little more than crumbling stone, now stood fully restored, its roof solid against weather, its interior large enough to comfortably house council meetings that had grown increasingly important as the Voss coalition continued expanding. Rosalind approached the base of the tower, calling up to Elena, with news that pulled her attention away from surveying the progress below. "My lady, envoys have arrived from the Eastern Territories. They wish to discuss formal alliance terms." Elena descended the tower quickly, her earlier exhaustion from the morning's training exercises fading beneath renewed energy at the prospect of further expanding her coalition's reach. In the months since the confrontation with Marcus Thornwood, word of the Voss territory's resurgence had spread steadily throughout the region, drawing interest from packs far beyond the immediate area surrounding her family's original lands. The envoys, representatives from a coalition of smaller eastern packs who had long struggled under pressure from larger territorial powers, waited in the main hall, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. Elena greeted them with the same careful diplomacy she had cultivated over months of careful negotiations, listening attentively to their concerns, before outlining terms that would benefit both parties, without demanding the kind of subservience they had clearly feared before arriving. "Your reputation precedes you," the lead envoy said, as negotiations drew to a close, genuine respect evident in his voice. Many doubted that a single wolf, however capable, could rebuild a fallen territory into something worth allying with. "You have proven those doubts wrong quite thoroughly." "I did not do this alone," Elena replied, gesturing toward Callum and Rosalind, who stood nearby overseeing the details of the agreement. "Every person who chose to stand with me contributed to what we have built here. That is the true strength of this coalition, not any single leader's ambition, but the collective will of people who refuse to accept that ruins must remain ruins forever." The Eastern envoys departed later that afternoon, formal alliance papers signed and sealed, adding yet another territory to the growing network of pacts, now aligned with Voss leadership. Elena watched them ride away, feeling a familiar swell of satisfaction, mixed with the ever-present awareness of how much work remained ahead. That evening, as the coalition gathered for their customary shared meal in the newly restored main hall, Callum approached Elena with news that immediately shifted the atmosphere of quiet celebration into something more serious. "My lady, there have been developments regarding Ashford territory that you should know about," he said quietly, drawing her slightly away from the main gathering. Elena felt her stomach tighten at the mention of her former home, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Go on." "Their standing has weakened considerably in recent months," Callum continued. "Several allied pacts have withdrawn support, citing concerns about leadership stability following the very public nature of your divorce. Trade negotiations have stalled without your diplomatic involvement, and I have heard whispers that the council itself is growing increasingly divided regarding Alpha King Ashford's judgment." Elena absorbed this information silently, surprised by the complicated mixture of emotions it stirred within her. She had not spent the past 6 months thinking of Damon or Ivy with any particular frequency, her attention consumed entirely by the demanding work of rebuilding her family's legacy. But hearing of Ashford's struggles brought back memories she had worked hard to move beyond, memories of betrayal and heartbreak that she had channeled into fuel for her own remarkable transformation, rather than allowing them to remain simply painful wounds. "That is unfortunate for them," Elena said finally, though her voice carried no particular satisfaction at the news. "But it is not something that concerns Voss territory directly." Callum studied her expression carefully, something thoughtful in his weathered eyes. "You do not feel any satisfaction, watching them struggle after everything that happened?" Elena considered the question honestly before responding. "I felt satisfaction watching this territory grow strong again. I felt satisfaction building alliances based on mutual respect rather than desperate necessity. Damon's struggles, whatever they might be, are simply consequences of choices he made. I do not need to celebrate them to feel that justice has already been served through everything we have built here." Callum nodded slowly, clearly understanding the wisdom underlying her words. "Wise perspective, my lady, though I suspect not everyone in Ashford territory shares your ability to move forward so gracefully." That night, after the shared meal concluded and most of the coalition had retired to their respective quarters within the growing settlement, Elena found herself once again standing alone near the ruins of her father's old study, now partially restored, but still carrying echoes of the past within its weathered stone walls. She thought of the woman she had been 6 months earlier, standing in this same spot, grieving a marriage and friendship that had shattered in a single devastating night. That woman felt like a distant memory now, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had learned that true strength came not from avoiding pain, but from choosing what to build in its aftermath. She thought of Rosalind's parents, of the wisdom about planting new gardens rather than forcing dead flowers to bloom again, and felt grateful for how thoroughly she had embraced that particular philosophy over the months since her arrival. The following weeks brought continued growth to the Voss coalition, each new alliance and successful negotiation adding further legitimacy to Elena's leadership. Word spread that her territory offered something increasingly rare throughout the region: protection without domination, partnership without the kind of controlling subservience that larger powers typically demanded from smaller allies. Pacts that had once felt vulnerable and isolated now found strength in numbers, united under Elena's careful, principled leadership. Delphine Marsh, the Ironvale Alpha who had been among the first to formally ally with Voss territory, visited personally during the height of autumn harvest season, bringing gifts of preserved food and genuine warmth that had grown into real friendship over the months of their alliance. "You have accomplished something remarkable here," Delphine said, surveying the bustling settlement with evident admiration as they walked together through the training yard. "When I first agreed to this alliance, I confess I hoped for protection against Thornwood's expansion, nothing more. I did not anticipate finding a genuine friend and partner in the process." "Nor did I," Elena admitted, smiling at the older woman with genuine affection. "I think we have both been fortunate in that regard." Delphine studied her for a moment, something knowing in her expression. "You have changed since I first met you, Elena. There is a confidence in you now that was still forming when we first negotiated our alliance. I imagine the path here was not an easy one." "It was not," Elena agreed simply, unwilling to dwell further on the painful details that had led her to this point. "But I would not trade what I have built here for anything I lost along the way." As autumn deepened into the early edges of winter, the Voss coalition continued strengthening, its reputation extending further throughout the region, with each passing week. Elena found herself increasingly recognized, not simply as the daughter of a fallen alpha attempting to reclaim lost territory, but as a genuine leader in her own right, respected for her fairness, her strategic thinking, and her unwavering commitment to the well-being of every pack that chose to align themselves with her growing coalition. She had not set out, 6 months earlier, to build something that might one day rival the power of territories like Ashford. Her only goal had been survival, the simple determination to prove that betrayal did not have to mean destruction. But standing now at the center of a thriving coalition, surrounded by loyal allies and genuine friends, who had helped her transform ruins into something remarkable, Elena began to understand that she had accomplished something far greater than mere survival. She had built a legacy entirely her own, untouched by the broken promises that had once threatened to define her future. And that legacy, she realized with quiet satisfaction, was only just beginning. Winter settled heavily over the region, blanketing both Ashford and Voss territories in the same cold silence, though the two lands experienced that season in dramatically different ways. In Voss territory, the cold months brought a different kind of challenge, one focused inward, as Elena's coalition worked to ensure every ally had sufficient supplies to weather the harsh conditions ahead. Storehouses that had been steadily filled throughout the autumn harvest now proved their worth, allowing Elena to distribute resources fairly, among not only her immediate settlement, but also the smaller allied packs who had struggled with scarcity in previous winters, without adequate support. "This is more generous than anyone expected," Fenwick commented one afternoon, as they organized supply shipments destined for the more distant allied territories. "Some of these smaller packs have never experienced this kind of support from a larger power before. Most simply demand tribute during difficult seasons, rather than offering assistance. That is precisely the difference I wanted this coalition to represent," Elena replied, checking inventory lists with careful attention. "Strength built on mutual support lasts far longer than strength built on fear and obligation." Her words proved accurate as winter progressed. Reports continued arriving of Ashford territory's ongoing struggles, their allied packs growing increasingly restless as resources stretched thin under leadership that had grown distracted and uncertain following months of internal turmoil. Meanwhile, Voss territory's reputation only strengthened, additional smaller packs reaching out to formally request alliance, after witnessing how generously Elena's coalition treated its existing partners during the difficult winter months. Elena received these reports with the same measured response she had maintained throughout the months since her divorce, neither celebrating Ashford's struggles nor allowing herself to become complacent about her own territory's continued success. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, how quickly fortune could shift, how easily strength could crumble, when leadership lost sight of the people it was meant to serve. It was during the deepest part of winter, when snow lay thick across the training yard, and most coalition activities had shifted indoors to accommodate the harsh weather, that unexpected visitors arrived at the gates of Voss territory. Elena was reviewing supply reports in the main hall when Callum entered, his expression carefully neutral, in a way that immediately put her on alert. "My lady, we have visitors. Alpha King Ashford has arrived, along with a small escort." Elena felt her breath catch slightly, surprise mixing with a complicated tangle of emotions she had believed largely resolved after months of focused work rebuilding her own life. She set down the reports she had been reviewing, taking a moment to steady herself before responding. Did he state his purpose for this visit? He requests a private audience with you, my lady. He claims it concerns matters of territorial importance, though I confess, I do not fully trust his motivations, given the history between you. Elena considered this carefully, weighing the wisdom of granting such a request against her own understandable wariness. She had built something remarkable since leaving Ashford territory, something that owed nothing to Damon's influence or approval, but avoiding him entirely, out of lingering hurt or discomfort, felt like a weakness she was no longer willing to indulge. I will meet with him, Elena said finally, in the main hall, with you present as witness. I have nothing to hide from my own counsel, and I suspect he understands that any private audience without appropriate oversight would be inappropriate given our history. Callum nodded approvingly at her decision before departing to arrange the meeting. Elena took several minutes to compose herself, smoothing her practical winter clothing and steadying her expression into something calm and authoritative, before making her way toward the main hall where Damon waited. She found him standing near the large fireplace that dominated one end of the hall, his posture tense despite the warmth radiating from the flames. He looked different than she remembered, she noted with some surprise. The confident ease that had once characterized his bearing, replaced by something more weathered, more careful. Months of struggling leadership had clearly taken their toll. Elena, he said as she entered, and something in his voice carried genuine uncertainty that she had rarely heard from him during their marriage. Damon, she replied evenly, taking a seat at the head of the main table, rather than approaching him directly, establishing clear distance and authority within her own territory. Callum tells me you wish to discuss matters of territorial importance. Damon hesitated, clearly having prepared different words for this meeting than the businesslike opening Elena had established. He moved to sit across from her at the table, Callum taking a position nearby, close enough to intervene if necessary but respectfully distant enough to allow the conversation appropriate space. Thornwood forces have been testing our northern borders more aggressively in recent weeks, Damon said finally, settling into the practical framing Elena had established. I understand your coalition has successfully repelled similar incursions. I am here to propose a mutual defense agreement between our territories. Elena studied him carefully, searching for any hint of manipulation or ulterior motive beneath his straightforward request. She found, somewhat to her surprise, genuine desperation in his expression, the look of a leader watching his territory struggle, without knowing quite how to reverse the decline. Ashford territory has weakened considerably since I departed, Elena said, not unkindly, but without softening the truth either. I have heard the reports. Damon's jaw tightened slightly, though he did not deny her assessment. Yes. I will not insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise. Our allied pacts have grown restless. Trade negotiations have stalled. I have made mistakes in leadership that I am still working to correct. And you believe an alliance with Voss territory would help address these struggles? I believe an alliance with Voss territory would benefit us both, Damon said carefully. Thornwood's aggression threatens the entire region, not simply your coalition or my own territory. A combined defense would strengthen both our positions considerably. Elena considered his proposal seriously, setting aside her personal history with the man sitting across from her, in favor of clear strategic thinking. A formal alliance with Ashford territory would indeed offer significant benefits, extending her coalition's influence and providing additional resources against Thornwood's continued aggressive expansion. But she was also acutely aware of the complicated history binding her to Damon, aware that any alliance would require careful boundaries to prevent old wounds from interfering with new arrangements. I am willing to consider a formal defense alliance, Elena said finally. But it will be structured as an equal partnership between two independent territories, not as any kind of return to our previous arrangement. I lead Voss territory now, entirely independent of Ashford influence, and that independence is not negotiable. I would not expect otherwise, Damon replied quickly, something almost like relief flickering across his features. I am not here to ask for anything beyond a practical alliance, Elena. I understand that whatever we once shared is firmly in the past. Something in his voice, however, suggested that this acceptance had not come easily, that months of watching her territory thrive independently had forced him to confront realities he perhaps would have preferred to avoid. Elena chose not to press further into whatever emotions lingered beneath his careful words, focusing instead on the practical details of the alliance they were beginning to negotiate. Over the following hour, Elena and Damon worked through the specific terms of their proposed defense agreement, Callum offering occasional input on matters of strategic importance. The negotiation proceeded smoothly, both parties approaching the discussion with genuine professionalism, despite the complicated history between them. By the time they finished, a solid framework had emerged, one that would benefit both territories without compromising the independence Elena had worked so hard to establish. As the meeting drew to a close and Damon prepared to depart, he lingered for a moment near the main hall's entrance, his expression carrying something Elena recognized as genuine, if belated, regret. "You have built something remarkable here, Elena," he said quietly. "I did not fully understand your strength when we were married. I am only now beginning to appreciate how thoroughly I underestimated you." Elena met his gaze steadily, feeling neither the sharp pain of old betrayal nor any lingering desire for reconciliation, simply a calm recognition of how far she had traveled since that terrible night in the training yard. "I did not need your appreciation to build this, Damon. I needed only the strength I already carried within myself, strength I did not fully recognize until circumstances forced me to discover it." Damon nodded slowly, accepting her words without argument. Perhaps that is the most important lesson either of us has learned from everything that happened. He departed shortly after, his small escort disappearing into the snowy landscape beyond Voss territory's walls, leaving Elena to reflect on the strange, complicated nature of the encounter. She felt no desire to rebuild what had been broken between them, no lingering romantic attachment pulling her toward reconciliation, but she also felt something close to peace, a sense that perhaps genuine growth was possible, even after devastating betrayal, both for herself and, apparently, for the man who had once caused her such profound pain. That evening, as she reviewed the finalized terms of their new defense alliance with Callum, Elena found herself thinking not of Damon or the marriage that had ended so painfully, but of the territory she had built in its aftermath, the genuine friendships forged through shared purpose, the steady accumulation of strength that had transformed ruins into something worth defending. Whatever complicated feelings the day's encounter had stirred, they existed now as simply one more chapter in a much larger story, one that Elena was writing entirely on her own terms. The alliance between Voss and Ashford territories proved its worth sooner than either leader anticipated. Barely 2 weeks after Damon's winter visit, word arrived that Thornwood forces had launched a coordinated assault against the northern borders of both territories simultaneously, clearly hoping to exploit whatever weakness remained from months of separate struggles. Elena received the urgent message just before dawn, a young scout arriving breathless and half-frozen from the long ride through snow-covered terrain. "They struck at first light, my lady," the scout reported, accepting a warm drink from Rosalind, while Elena quickly assembled her senior advisors in the main hall. "Ashford's northern outpost is under heavy pressure. Their commander is requesting immediate reinforcement per the terms of your alliance." Elena felt the weight of the moment settle over her, aware that this represented the first true test of everything she had built over the past several months. A defense alliance meant nothing if it failed to hold during genuine crisis. "Callum, ready our fastest riders. We move within the hour." The journey to Ashford's northern border took most of the day, Elena riding alongside a contingent of her best-trained warriors, the cold wind biting through their winter gear as they pushed their horses hard across the snow-covered landscape. She thought, during the long hours of travel, of how far she had come since that terrible night nearly 7 months ago, from a devastated bride discovering betrayal in a moonlit training yard, to a leader riding to defend an alliance with the very man who had once broken her trust so completely. They arrived at the northern outpost as afternoon light began fading toward evening, finding the scene exactly as grim as the scout's report had suggested. Ashford forces, though fighting valiantly, were clearly outnumbered, Thornwood's aggressive assault having exploited weaknesses that months of internal turmoil had left largely unaddressed. Elena spotted Damon immediately, positioned near the front lines, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and fierce determination as he coordinated his remaining forces. Voss reinforcements have arrived, Elena announced, her voice carrying clearly across the chaotic battlefield, as her warriors moved swiftly to reinforce the struggling Ashford lines. Damon's eyes found hers across the distance, something like profound relief flickering across his features before he returned his attention to the immediate crisis at hand. Elena moved efficiently among her own forces, directing strategic positioning with the same careful competence that had defined her leadership throughout the coalition's growth, her presence providing exactly the reinforcement Ashford's beleaguered defenses desperately needed. The battle continued for several intense hours, both territories' forces working in genuine coordination despite months of separate struggles, their combined strength gradually shifting the tide against Thornwood's aggressive assault. Elena fought alongside her warriors when necessary, her training over the past months having sharpened skills that had lain largely dormant during her time as Ashford's queen, focused primarily on diplomatic matters rather than direct combat. As evening fully settled over the battlefield, Thornwood forces began a gradual retreat, clearly recognizing that the combined strength of two allied territories represented a challenge they had not adequately anticipated. Marcus Thornwood himself, Elena noted as the fighting wound down, was among those retreating, his earlier confidence during their first encounter now replaced by evident frustration at this unexpected setback. The aftermath of the battle brought a strange, exhausted camaraderie between forces that had, until recently, belonged to entirely separate territories. Elena found herself working alongside Ashford warriors to tend wounded fighters from both sides, the shared crisis having temporarily dissolved whatever lingering awkwardness remained from her complicated history with their Alpha King. Damon approached her as the immediate crisis began settling into more manageable aftermath work, his expression carrying genuine gratitude that went beyond simple relief at successful defense. "Thank you, Elena. Truly. Without your reinforcements, this outpost would have fallen." "That is precisely what alliances are meant to accomplish," Elena replied, though she allowed herself a small, tired smile at the genuine appreciation evident in his voice. "We support each other during crisis. That was always the foundation of what we agreed to build together." They stood together for a moment, surveying the aftermath of the battle, snow-stained here and there with evidence of the day's conflict, wounded warriors being tended by healers from both territories working in careful coordination. Elena felt a complicated mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction, aware that this successful defense would only further strengthen both territories' standing throughout the region. "I owe you an apology," Damon said quietly, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon rather than directly on Elena. "Not simply for what happened between us those months ago, though certainly for that as well, but for underestimating what you were capable of building, both personally and as a leader. I dismissed your strength for far too long, believing my own position somehow more secure, without fully understanding how much of that security depended on partnership rather than individual authority." Elena considered his words carefully before responding, aware that genuine growth, however belated, deserved acknowledgement even when it arrived from someone who had once caused significant pain. "Growth matters more than perfection, Damon. I am glad you have come to understand these lessons, even if the path to that understanding was difficult for us both. Is there any possibility," Damon began carefully, "that we might eventually rebuild something beyond simple political alliance? I understand if the answer is no, given everything that happened. But I find myself unable to stop wondering." Elena met his gaze steadily, feeling neither anger nor lingering romantic attachment, simply calm clarity about her own path forward. "I have built something remarkable since leaving Ashford territory, Damon. A coalition, genuine friendships, a legacy entirely my own that owes nothing to what we once shared. I am grateful for the alliance between our territories, and I respect the growth you have shown these past months. But I do not wish to return to what we once had. That chapter of my life is finished, and I have no desire to reopen it." Damon absorbed her words with quiet acceptance, nodding slowly despite the evident disappointment in his expression. "I understand, and I respect your decision, even as I recognize the wisdom in it. You deserve someone who values your strength from the beginning, rather than only recognizing it after losing you." The words carried genuine sincerity, and Elena found herself grateful for this final, honest exchange between them, a conversation that allowed both parties to fully close the chapter of their complicated shared history, without lingering bitterness or unresolved tension. Whatever came next for each of them, it would proceed along entirely separate paths, connected only by the practical alliance between their territories, rather than any deeper personal bond. As the Voss forces prepared to return home the following morning, their duty to reinforce Ashford's defenses successfully fulfilled, Elena found Ivy waiting near the outpost gates, her expression uncertain, as Elena approached to mount her horse for the journey back to Voss territory. "Elena," Ivy said softly, "I heard about the battle. I am glad you arrived safely, to help defend the northern border." Elena studied her former friend for a long moment, noting the genuine exhaustion evident in Ivy's face, the toll that months of complicated consequences had clearly taken on someone who had once seemed so carefree and confident. "Thank you, Ivy. I hope Ashford territory continues finding its footing in the months ahead." "I am sorry," Ivy said suddenly, her voice breaking slightly, "for everything. I know those words mean little after everything that happened, but I need you to know that I understand now how thoroughly I betrayed our friendship. I think about it every day." Elena considered her response carefully, aware that this moment offered a kind of closure that had been missing from her departure so many months ago. "I forgive you, Ivy. Not because what you did was acceptable, but because carrying that anger forward would only weigh me down as I continue building my own future. I hope you find whatever peace you are searching for, though I do not believe our friendship can ever be rebuilt to what it once was." Ivy nodded, tears gathering in her eyes, though she did not argue against Elena's assessment. "I understand. Thank you, Elena, for your forgiveness and for everything you have accomplished since leaving. I am genuinely glad you found strength in the aftermath of what I helped cause." Elena mounted her horse, offering Ivy one final nod, before turning to join her assembled warriors for the journey home. As they rode away from the northern outpost, the morning sun beginning to break through winter clouds overhead, Elena felt something settle fully into place within her chest, a sense of complete closure regarding the painful chapter that had once threatened to define her entire future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as the leader of a thriving coalition, surrounded by loyal friends and allies who had helped her transform devastating betrayal into remarkable strength. The ride back to Voss territory felt different than any journey she had taken since that terrible night months ago, lighter somehow, unburdened by lingering grief or unresolved anger, ready instead to embrace whatever new challenges and opportunities awaited her thriving territory in the months and years ahead. Spring arrived early that year, melting the last stubborn patches of snow from Voss territory's training yard and coaxing fresh green growth from soil that had spent months buried beneath winter's heavy blanket. Elena stood near the outer walls, now fully repaired and reinforced following the successful defense against Thornwood's assault months earlier, watching as new construction continued expanding the settlement further than she had ever imagined possible during those first difficult days, rebuilding from nothing but ruins and determination. The coalition had grown substantially since the battle at Ashford's northern border, word of the successful combined defense spreading throughout the region, and drawing even more interest from smaller packs, seeking the kind of principled, protective leadership that Voss territory had come to represent. "The Eastern Coalition has requested a formal meeting," Callum reported, approaching Elena with a stack of correspondence that had arrived throughout the morning. "They wish to discuss expanding trade routes now that the roads have cleared following winter." "Schedule it for next week," Elena replied, reviewing the letter with practiced efficiency. "And what of the Thornwood situation? Have there been any further incursions since the battle?" "None," Callum confirmed, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Reports suggest that Marcus Thornwood's Alpha has grown considerably more cautious following their defeat. Several of their previously absorbed territories have even begun reaching out, hoping to negotiate more favorable independent status, now that Thornwood's expansion efforts have clearly weakened." Elena felt genuine satisfaction at this news, aware that the successful defense had accomplished far more than simply protecting immediate territory. It had shifted the entire balance of power throughout the region, demonstrating that aggressive expansion could be successfully resisted through principled alliance rather than desperate submission. Packs that had once felt trapped under Thornwood's controlling influence now saw a genuine alternative in the coalition Elena had built, one that offered protection and partnership without demanding the kind of subservience larger powers typically required. Rosalind approached later that afternoon, her expression carrying a mixture of excitement and nervousness that immediately caught Elena's attention. My lady, might I speak with you privately? Elena led her young friend to a quiet corner of the training yard, curious about what had prompted such careful hesitation. Of course, Rosalind. What is on your mind? I have been offered a position, Rosalind said carefully. The Eastern Coalition has requested that I serve as their primary liaison with Voss territory, given how closely I have worked alongside you these past months. It would mean significant responsibility, representing our interests in ongoing negotiations. Elena felt a swell of pride at this news, recognizing how far Rosalind had grown since their first difficult days working together to clear debris from the ruins of Elena's family's old command post. The young woman who had once lost everything, drifting between territories with no true home, had transformed into someone capable of significant diplomatic responsibility. I think you would excel in that position, Elena said warmly. Your instincts for fair negotiation have always impressed me, Rosalind. I would be proud to see you take on this new responsibility. Rosalind's face lit with genuine happiness at Elena's encouragement. Thank you, my lady. I would not have believed, all those months ago clearing rubble from these ruins, that I might one day hold such an important position within this coalition. You earned this opportunity through your own dedication and skill, Elena replied firmly. Never doubt that. As spring progressed into early summer, the Voss coalition continued strengthening its position throughout the region, new alliances forming steadily as word spread of the protective, principled leadership that had transformed abandoned ruins into a thriving network of allied territories. Elena found herself increasingly recognized not simply as the daughter of a fallen alpha reclaiming lost territory, but as one of the most respected leaders throughout the entire region, her judgment sought after by packs far beyond her immediate coalition. During a particularly warm afternoon in early summer, nearly a full year after that devastating night in Ashford's training yard, Elena received an unexpected visitor at the gates of her territory. Delphine Marsh arrived not for routine coalition business, but carrying news of significant importance that immediately drew Elena's full attention. There is a gathering being organized, Delphine explained as they walked together through the flourishing training yard, now surrounded by well-established structures that bore little resemblance to the ruins Elena had first encountered a year earlier. Representatives from every major territory throughout the region, meeting to discuss the shifting balance of power following Thornwood's weakened influence and your coalition's continued growth. They wish for you to attend as a primary voice in these discussions. Elena absorbed this news with quiet astonishment, recognizing the significance of such an invitation. A year ago, she had been nothing more than a betrayed bride fleeing a broken marriage, uncertain whether she could rebuild anything meaningful from the ruins of her family's fallen territory. Now, she was being invited to help shape the future balance of power throughout the entire region, her voice considered essential to conversations that would determine how surrounding territories navigated the changes her coalition's success had set into motion. I would be honored to attend, Elena said, though privately she felt the full weight of how far her journey had carried her since that terrible night of betrayal that had once threatened to define her entire future. The regional gathering took place several weeks later, drawing leaders from territories throughout the area to a neutral meeting ground where careful negotiations would determine the shape of alliances and boundaries for years to come. Elena arrived with Callum and Rosalind at her side, representing a coalition that had grown from nothing but ruins and determination into one of the most respected and influential powers throughout the entire region. Damon was present as well, representing Ashford territory, which had continued steadily recovering under his more careful, humbled leadership following months of genuine growth and reflection. Their alliance had remained strong throughout the following months, professional and mutually beneficial, though the personal complications that had once defined their relationship had settled into something comfortable and distant, two former partners who had each found their own separate paths forward. Elena Voss, announced the gathering's neutral moderator, an elderly alpha respected throughout the region for her wisdom and fairness. Your coalition's remarkable growth over the past year has fundamentally reshaped the balance of power throughout this region. We would value your perspective on how these territories might continue building toward lasting peace and mutual prosperity. Elena rose from her seat, feeling the weight of every gaze in the gathering settling upon her. Leaders from territories both large and small, waiting to hear her thoughts on matters that would shape the region's future for years to come. She thought, briefly, of the frightened young woman who had once stood in a moonlit training yard, discovering her husband's betrayal, uncertain whether she would survive such devastating heartbreak. That woman felt impossibly distant now, replaced by someone who had transformed unimaginable pain into remarkable strength. Lasting peace requires more than simple military strength or territorial expansion, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the gathered assembly. It requires genuine partnership, built on mutual respect, protection offered freely, rather than demanded through fear, and leadership that prioritizes the well-being of its people above personal ambition. This is the foundation upon which my coalition has grown, and I believe it offers a model that could benefit territories throughout this entire region. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering, and Elena felt genuine satisfaction watching leaders from territories far beyond her own coalition nod thoughtfully at her words, recognizing the wisdom that had guided her remarkable transformation from devastated bride to respected regional leader. Whatever came next for the broader region, she understood clearly that her voice would carry genuine influence in shaping that future, an influence earned entirely through her own strength and determination, rather than any borrowed authority from marriage or inherited title. As the gathering continued through the following days, careful negotiations gradually establishing new boundaries and alliances that would define the region for years to come, Elena found herself standing at the center of a transformation she could scarcely have imagined during those first devastating days following her divorce. She had not simply survived betrayal. She had built something far more remarkable from its ashes, a legacy entirely her own that would carry forward long after the pain of that terrible night had faded into simple, distant memory. 1 year to the day since that devastating night in Ashford's moonlit training yard, Elena stood before her entire coalition, gathered together in the fully restored main hall of what had once been nothing more than crumbling ruins. The hall overflowed with representatives from every allied territory, leaders and warriors, and simple loyal followers who had each played a part in transforming Elena's shattered marriage into the foundation for something far greater than she had ever imagined possible. Callum stood near the front of the gathering, his weathered face carrying visible pride as he watched the woman he had first welcomed home a year earlier, now commanding the respect and loyalty of an entire thriving region. 1 year ago, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall. I arrived at these ruins with nothing but grief, a handful of loyal followers, and a determination to prove that betrayal did not have to mean destruction. I did not know, standing among crumbling walls and overgrown training grounds, whether I possessed the strength to rebuild what had been lost. I only knew that I refused to remain broken by choices that were never truly mine to bear. She paused, looking out across the assembled crowd, faces both familiar and new, gathered together in genuine celebration of everything they had built collectively over the past 12 months. Rosalind stood near the front, alongside Fenwick, both of them smiling with evident pride at how far their small group of loyalists had traveled together since those first difficult days of hauling debris and salvaging usable materials from the wreckage of Elena's family legacy. What we have built here together, Elena continued, is proof that strength does not require avoiding pain, but rather choosing what to build in its aftermath. Every person in this hall contributed to that transformation, whether through the sweat and labor of rebuilding these walls, the courage of forming alliances that once seemed impossible, or simply the loyalty of believing in something worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. Applause swept through the hall, warm and genuine, and Elena felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though these tears carried none of the devastating grief that had once defined her darkest moments following Damon's betrayal. These were tears of gratitude, of overwhelming pride in everything her coalition had accomplished together, transforming abandoned ruins into one of the most respected and influential territories throughout the entire region. Delphine Marsh rose from her seat near the front of the gathering, raising a cup in formal toast. To Elena Voss, whose strength and vision transformed devastating betrayal into remarkable triumph, and whose leadership has brought genuine peace and prosperity to territories throughout this entire region. The hall erupted in enthusiastic agreement, cups raised high in celebration of everything Elena's remarkable journey had accomplished over the course of a single transformative year. She accepted the tribute with genuine humility, aware that whatever praise she received belonged equally to every person who had chosen to stand beside her throughout the difficult months of rebuilding. Later that evening, as the celebration continued with music and shared food filling the restored main hall late into the night, Elena stepped outside briefly, seeking a quiet moment away from the joyful chaos, to reflect on everything the past year had brought her. She walked toward the ruins of her father's old study, now fully restored but still carrying echoes of memory within its familiar stone walls, and stood quietly beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars. She thought of her father, of the stories he used to tell about strength that lived within a person's own chest, waiting to be called upon when everything else had burned away. She understood those stories fully now, in a way she never could have during her childhood, having lived through devastating betrayal and emerged from its ashes not simply intact, but genuinely transformed into someone stronger, wiser, and more capable than she had ever imagined possible. "You would be proud of what we built here," she whispered into the quiet night air, though she knew no answer would come from her father's long absence. But standing there, surrounded by the tangible evidence of everything her coalition had accomplished together, she felt his presence anyway, a quiet strength woven into the very foundation of the territory she had rebuilt in his memory. Callum found her there several minutes later, approaching with characteristic quiet respect that had defined their partnership throughout the entire journey. "The celebration continues without you, my lady, though I suspect everyone understands your need for a quiet moment tonight." "Thank you, Callum," Elena said, turning to face the man who had believed in her from the very beginning, who had offered his loyalty and guidance when she possessed nothing but grief and determination. "For everything you have done these past 12 months, I could not have built any of this without your steady support." "You give me too much credit," Callum replied, though genuine warmth colored his voice. "I simply recognize strength that already existed within you, my lady. Everything we built together grew from that foundation, not from anything I contributed beyond loyal service." Elena smiled, grateful beyond measure for the friendship and partnership that had carried her through the most difficult transformation of her entire life. "Regardless, I am deeply grateful. Shall we return to the celebration? I believe there is still much to toast this evening." They walked back together toward the warm light and joyful sounds spilling from the main hall, and Elena felt a profound sense of completion settle over her, the recognition that whatever came next for her thriving coalition, she had already accomplished something remarkable that no amount of future challenge could diminish. She had faced devastating betrayal and emerged from its aftermath not broken, but transformed into a leader respected throughout an entire region, surrounded by genuine friends and loyal allies who had helped her build a legacy entirely her own. As she rejoined the celebration, accepting warm congratulations and genuine affection from the assembled coalition that had become her true family over the course of this transformative year, Elena allowed herself to fully embrace the joy of the moment, unburdened by lingering grief or unresolved anger from the betrayal that had once threatened to define her entire future. She thought, briefly, of Damon and Ivy, of the marriage and friendship that had shattered so completely a year earlier. She felt no lingering bitterness toward either of them now, only quiet gratitude that their betrayal had ultimately pushed her toward discovering strength she might never have found otherwise. Strength that had allowed her to build something far more meaningful than the comfortable but hollow arrangement she had once mistaken for genuine partnership. The celebration continued late into the night, laughter and music filling the restored hall that had once been nothing more than crumbling ruins, testament to everything that patient determination and genuine partnership could accomplish, even in the aftermath of devastating heartbreak. Elena moved among her coalition, offering genuine gratitude to every person who had contributed to this remarkable transformation, each conversation reinforcing her understanding that true strength came not from avoiding pain, but from choosing courage and determination in its aftermath. As the celebration finally began winding down in the deepest hours of night, Elena stood once more near the entrance of the main hall, watching her coalition members gradually retire to their respective quarters throughout the thriving settlement that had grown from nothing but ruins and unwavering determination. She felt genuine peace settle over her, complete and unshakable, the understanding that whatever challenges the future might bring, she now possessed the strength, the allies, and the wisdom to face them with confidence. She was no longer the devastated bride who had discovered betrayal in a moonlit training yard 1 year earlier. She was Elena Voss, leader of a thriving coalition, respected throughout an entire region, a woman who had transformed the worst night of her life into the foundation for a legacy that would carry forward for generations to come. And as she finally retired to her own quarters that night, Surrounded by the settlement she had built entirely through her own strength and determination, Elena understood with complete certainty that she had never truly needed anyone else to reclaim her crown. She had only ever needed herself.